Imagine you're driving down a quiet country road in Minnesota. It's February, it's freezing cold, and the snow is piled high on the roadside. Up ahead, you see a small car pulled over, and standing near the trunk in the freezing cold is a young man. You slow down, you think maybe he's having some car trouble, maybe he needs help. But as you drive past, the man turns. He looks up, and for a split second, you lock eyes with him. He gives you a look so intense, so chilling, it makes the hairs on your arms stand up. You keep driving, a little unsettled, but you figure it's just a stranger having a bad day in the snow. What you don't realize, and what you won't find out until the police knock on your door, is that the man you just locked eyes with wasn't stuck in the snow. He was actively dumping the murdered body of a 25-year-old woman into the snowbank. You just made eye contact with the killer. But here is the detail that makes this case just so mind-blowing. The killer, after locking eyes with the witness, he just got into his car and drove away. And he kept driving for exactly 50 years. Today we are talking about the heartbreaking, decades-long case of Mary Kay Schleis. This is a story about a brilliant young woman, a witness who saw a murderer in action, a serial killer who served as a massive red herring, and the amazing DNA science that finally brought a monster to justice in the year 2025. Let's get into it. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, welcome to the fam. My name is Zara, and on this channel, we dive deep into true crime cases. We try to shine a light on the stories that need to be told, like the cold cases where families have waited lifetimes for answers. And if you're as passionate about these cases as I am, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button right now. And seriously, smashing that like button helps so much. It tells YouTube that these stories actually matter. Sharing is also highly encouraged because you just never know who's watching. Also, for those of you who want to become a more active part of the community, I'd love for you to consider becoming a channel member. When you join, you get instant access to our private Discord server, and that's where the conversation really keeps going. We have in-depth discussions about the cases, share theories, and you can suggest cases for me to cover. And honestly, we just chat about life and support each other because, let's face it, these stories in life can be really heavy. So if that sounds like your kind of place, just click the join button right below this video, somewhere there. Let's take it back to 1974, and we need to talk about the culture of the 1970s, specifically the culture of hitchhiking. Today, if you saw a young woman standing on the side of the road, with her thumb out, you would immediately think, oh no, that's not safe. You'd probably pull over to help her, or you'd call the police at least to make sure that she was safe, because we have all grown up in this true crime era. We know about the Ted Bundys, the Ed Kempers, the highway serial killers. We know the absolute danger of getting into a car with a stranger. But in the early 1970s, it was a completely different world. We've talked about this in other cases, but if you didn't know, during this time specifically, hitchhiking wasn't just common, it was like a cultural movement. It was the way college students, artists, and young people would explore the country. It was seen as an adventure, as a way to meet new people, as a sign of just freedom. The world just felt a bit safer, or at least people believed it was safer. And I always wonder what that felt like, because I don't feel that way about our world right now at all. There seemed to be this profound level of trust in other people. You trusted that guy pulling over in the station wagon was just a nice local helping you out, happy to help you save some bus fare. It's a kind of innocence that we just don't have anymore. And sadly, it was exactly this innocence, this trust, that predators learn to exploit. The 1970s would become a golden age of the American serial killer, and the highways were their hunting grounds. And tragically, Mary Kay Schleis was about to step right into that dark reality. Let's talk about Mary, because in most of the articles that I've seen in these cold cases that stretch on for decades, the victim's just often reduced to like a little black and white crime scene photo or a headline, but Mary was so much more than that, and I feel like it doesn't get talked about. Mary Kay Schleis was born on November 4th, 1948, and was 25 years old in the winter of 1974. She grew up in Champlin, Minnesota with her two brothers, and they all went to Anoka High School. She was a bright, vibrant, and incredibly talented young woman, and this was first seen when she was in high school, because this is where her artistic talent started to show. And after high school, she then attended the University of Minnesota on a scholarship. She studied art, and then she graduated with honors and multiple recognitions, which is a huge accomplishment. And then she continued on towards a master's degree. She was brilliant, she was driven, and she had this deep creative soul. Mary was truly an artist. She saw the world differently. Her friends and family described her as really free-spirited, very independent, and someone who just marched to the beat of her own drum. She was the kind of person who embraced the adventurous spirit of the 70s. She didn't want a typical, boring 9-to-5 life. She wanted to create, she wanted to experience, she wanted to travel. She even studied abroad for some time and became fluent in German, Danish, and also began studying Japanese. Her classmates and professors said she was this bright, driven, and full of life type of girl. She would create sculptures and paintings that focused on women's experiences, and she hung them on her walls, and some were even displayed at the Women's Institute for Social Change at the YCA. In February 1974, Mary had a very specific goal. There was an art show happening in Chicago, and for a young, aspiring artist living in the Minneapolis area, this was a big deal. It was a chance to see new work, get inspired, maybe network. She wanted to be there. But like a lot of 25-year-old artists recently out of college, she was on a very tight budget. So she made a decision that was completely normal for her and her peers at the time. Mary was known to hitchhike around the Midwest, so she packed a small bag, she bundled up against the brutal winter, and decided she was going to hitchhike from Minneapolis to Chicago. It's a drive of about 400 miles or 640 kilometers, so it's pretty far, and it's just straight down the Interstate 94. She told her friends her plan, and nobody panicked. Nobody told her that she was crazy. They just told her to be safe and have fun at the art show. On February 15, 1974, at about 10:30 a.m., she grabbed her bag. She left her apartment in uptown Minneapolis. She carried a small sign she made from cardboard that said Madison. Her plan was to go from Minneapolis to Madison, Wisconsin, and then get to Chicago from there finally. She was wearing a tan fur-lined coat with a maroon turtleneck, blue jeans, and had her purse, and her roommate Judith saw her leave the apartment that morning. Mary was aware of some of the hitchhiking horror stories, but she was young and she was brave. She had done it so many times actually, and nothing bad had ever happened before, so this time to her was no different. The morning of February 15th, 1974 is freezing. The weather in the Midwest is unforgiving. Not only is there snow on the ground and the wind chill is so extremely bitter, but Mary just makes her way to the outskirts of Minneapolis, finds a good spot near the highway, and then holds up her sign and then puts her thumb out. We don't know exactly how long she stood in the freezing cold for. We don't know how many cars passed her by. But eventually, a small, compact car slows down and pulls over. You can imagine the relief she must have felt, getting out of the freezing cold, climbing into a warm car, thanking the driver for stopping. She probably brushed the snow off her coat, settled into the passenger seat, and told the driver she was heading to Chicago for an art show. What she didn't know was that she had just made the final fatal mistake of her life. She hadn't been picked up by a friendly local or a traveling salesman like she may have in the past. She had been picked up by a monster. Now, I want you to prepare yourselves because the details of what happened next and specifically how this killer operated are just so infuriating. And I think what's most upsetting about this is that it just all happened so incredibly fast, like incredibly fast, from the moment she stepped out of her apartment to then facing this monster. So they're driving down the highway crossing from Minnesota into western Wisconsin. And for a while, it might have just seemed like a normal ride, but somewhere along the way, the driver's true intentions became terrifyingly clear. According to official documents that would come out, decades later, the driver didn't want to just give Mary a ride. He wanted what? What do most of them want? Sex. He propositioned her, making aggressive, unwanted sexual advances. Now, remember how Mary's family described her, right? She was fiercely independent. She was tough. She was not the kind of woman who would just submit to this type of request. So Mary said no. She refused him. She fought back against this creep who thought he was entitled to her body just because he offered her a ride in the snow. And because her rejection bruised his fragile, pathetic ego, his reaction was explosive. The driver reached around and pulled out a knife. In the confined space of that compact car, Mary had nowhere to run. He attacked her. stabbing her multiple times. The brutality of it is honestly just sickening, just to think of that small space. She's just this young woman trying to go to an art show. Now she's fighting for her life in the passenger seat of a stranger's car. After he murdered her, because that's what happened, he killed her, he didn't panic. He was cold, he was calculated, and he drove out to a remote area in Dunn County, Wisconsin, specifically at this intersection in the township of Springbrook. It was empty, it was rural, and it was covered in deep snow. The perfect place to hide a body. So he pulls over, he gets out into the freezing cold, and then he goes to the passenger door and then he drags Mary's lifeless body out from the car and then begins to throw her into a snowbank. He's trying to hide her, trying to erase what he just did. And this is the moment that makes this case so incredibly scary. So while he's standing there in the middle of dumping her body, a car approaches the intersection. The driver is a local man named Dennis Anderson. Dennis, or Denny as he was known, just thought it was a good day for a drive. He took his dog and he just hopped in the car with no plans, no urgency, no stress. And after doing some shopping, he's back in his car at about 1:30 p.m. And Denny is just driving along. So he decides now that he's not ready to head home yet. So he takes a turn down an isolated road and he sees this gold-colored compact car pulled over. He sees a man pulling something out of the passenger side, so he slows down. He looks over thinking he might need to offer some help, and as Denny drives past, the killer turns his head and they lock eyes. However, this man looked almost surprised and angry, so Denny just looked away and kept driving. But something did not sit right with him about this entire moment. You know, that gut feeling you can't shake? And look at how this even happened, okay? Whether you believe in God or not, this was just not a coincidence. He was meant to see the killer. A neighbor and friend of the Anderson family, Mary Dodge, later said that Denny said he'll never forget the look on this guy's face. Denny stared directly into the eyes of a murderer who was holding a dead girl in the snow, but he didn't know it. But he knew something was not right. So Denny did keep driving, but his gut was telling him something was incredibly wrong. So then he drove like a short distance up, but then he stopped, then he turned back around. But by the time Denny got back to the same location, the compact car was gone. The man with the chilling stare had vanished. But Denny could see what the man had been pulling out of his car. It was just on the side of the road. It was a body. It wasn't moving. So Denny got back into his car, raced home to tell his wife about what he saw, and he then got a neighbor to come with him to help the person in the ditch. When they came back, they could see it was a young woman, but she was covered in blood and she was already dead. Mary was left alone in the snowbank. Denny and his neighbor rushed to a nearby house and then called the police. The Dunn County sheriffs arrived at the scene shortly after Denny's call, and what they found was a nightmare, as you can imagine. The victim was deceased, the victim of a brutal stabbing. They quickly identified the body as Mary Schlase from Minneapolis. The investigation kicked into high gear. They had a victim, they had a timeline, and incredibly, they had an eyewitness who had looked the killer dead in his eyes. They had the tire tracks from the car and Denny's description of the gold compact car and the man's face. And you would think with all of this, an arrest was just so obvious, but crime scene technicians took photos and measurements of the tire tracks, but the snow didn't actually allow the plaster molds to set right into the tire track, so they couldn't actually get the actual tire track prints for evidence. But they found something else, something really important. In the struggle, or maybe when he was frantically dumping her body, the killer had dropped something in the snow near Mary's body. It was an orange and black knit stocking cap, a winter beanie. Investigators bagged it. They knew it belonged to the killer. It was the ultimate smoking gun. When Mary's body was sent in for an autopsy, they found she had been really badly beaten as well. Her nose was broken, she had a ton of bruises all over her face and body, and had been stabbed 15 times in the neck, back, and stomach. So I was wondering, did he beat her first? And then when she didn't comply, he then decided to use the knife. It was determined the knife used had a very thin blade. But you guys, we have to remember the era. It's 1974. DNA testing does not exist. Forensics in 1974 meant looking at blood types, maybe trying to pull a fingerprint and relying on eyewitness sketches. They analyzed the stocking cap, and inside they found human hairs, the killer's hairs. But without the technology to actually extract DNA profiles from those rootless hairs, they were practically useless, and they were just tiny, frustrating clues sitting in an evidence room. The police followed up on tips. They searched the area. They circulated sketches based on Denny's description of the man, but the killer had a head start. And the highway system meant he could have been from anywhere, heading in any direction. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and the leads just dried up. The case of the beautiful artist murdered in the snow went cold very quickly. And for decades, Mary's family was left with a gaping hole in their hearts, wondering who killed their daughter and why. As the decades dragged on, investigators never stopped looking at the Mary Schlase file. Cold case detectives would pull the boxes every now and then, hoping a fresh set of eyes might spot something new. And eventually they found a suspect who fit the profile so perfectly, it felt like the case was finally solved. They believed Mary had been a victim of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. Enter Randall Woodfield. If you haven't heard about Randall before, he is pretty terrifying. He's known as the I-5 killer. He terrorized the Interstate 5 corridor along the West Coast, committing multiple murders, sexual assaults, and robberies. And Interstate 5, or the I-5, is the main major highway stretching along the US West Coast from the Mexican border to San Isidro, California, to the Canadian border in Blaine, Washington. So it serves as this vital corridor connecting major metropolitan areas like San Diego, Los Angeles, Sacramento, Portland, and Seattle. But here is where it gets crazy. Randall wasn't just a nobody bad guy. He was a former star athlete. In 1974, he had actually been drafted by the NFL to play for the Green Bay Packers. Investigators started looking at timelines, and then they realized that in February of 1974, the exact time Mary was murdered, Randall was traveling from his home in Portland, Oregon, across the country to Green Bay, Wisconsin. His route would have taken him right through the Midwest, right along Interstate 94, right past Minneapolis, and straight through Dunn County. It was the perfect missing puzzle piece. A known violent sexual predator crossing the exact highway where Mary was picked up at the exact time she was murdered. Randall was known for being extremely violent, much like to the level of what happened to Mary. So for years, the theory among many in law enforcement was that Randall was the man Denny Anderson saw in the snow. And it just made so much sense, like it gave the family a suspect and it tied up this loose end. But there was one massive problem. It just wasn't true. As DNA technology slowly became better and better in the late 90s and 2000s, investigators finally managed to get a basic profile from the evidence left at Mary's crime scene, and then they compared it against Randall. And it was clearly a negative match. So can you imagine the devastation for the detectives, for the family? You think you finally have the monster who killed Mary. I'm sure it was a long process going through this. You think it's a notorious serial killer who was already behind bars, and science, DNA, just rips that closure away. Randall was a complete red herring. They were back to square one, a cold case. They had that beanie in the evidence box and a killer who was still out there living his life as a free man after murdering Mary in cold blood. So the years kept passing, the 1980s, the 1990s, 2000s, 2010s. Denny Anderson, the witness who saw the killer, never forgot that face. Mary's family got older, always carrying the weight of the unknown. What happened to their daughter? They never got to see her grow older and have a family of her own. But while the killer was living his life, getting older, probably thinking he had committed the perfect crime, science was quietly catching up to him. By 2020, a revolutionary new tool had changed the scope of cold case investigations. They now had investigative genetic genealogy, or IgG, and this is the same incredible science that caught the Golden State Killer. The Dunn County Sheriff's Office, refusing to give up, decided to just take another shot at that stocking cap or beanie that was still in evidence. So they partnered with the IgG Center at Ramapo College in New Jersey. And I want to take a second to explain how absolutely brilliant the work at Ramapo College is. So for decades, the hairs inside that stocking cap was just useless because they didn't have the root attached, right? Which is where traditional DNA is easily extracted from. But Ramapo College works with cutting edge labs that specialize in extracting viable DNA from rootless hair shafts. So it's this incredibly complex, delicate work. And they did it. With those hairs from the beanie, they finally, after 50 years, pulled a complete DNA profile off the man who wore that hat. But having a DNA profile doesn't mean you just instantly know the killer, right? If the guy isn't in the police database, you just have a string of genetic code. And this is where the genealogy comes in. So to make it a bit simpler, and I don't know, I didn't know this before, but apparently 99.9% of DNA around that from all people is the same. So isn't that crazy? But that 0.1% controls individual traits like hair color, height, etc. So this would be unique to each individual person. So if DNA is left behind at a crime scene, then that sample can be matched to one person like a fingerprint. Like, does that make sense? So weirdly enough, all humans, we all share majority of the DNA. Like, I think it's like 99.4 or 99.9%, but that tiny like point something percent up to 0.1% is what identifies us. Isn't that wild? And that's what carries all of our identifying traits. It's wild. So the experts at Ramapo College took that DNA profile and uploaded it to a public genealogy database, the kind people use to find their distant ancestors, and they got a hit. But it wasn't the killer, it was a distant relative. Imagine having to build a massive family tree, tracing back to the 1800s, mapping out thousands of cousins, marriages, births, and deaths just to narrow down the branches. So the team at Ramapo College spent thousands of hours meticulously building this tree for this DNA. So finally, they followed a branch down to a specific family line in Minnesota, and then they identified a woman. And through their research, they realized this woman was the daughter of the killer. So they managed to interview her, and then she agreed to provide a DNA sample for testing. And it did conclude that her biological father matched the profile of the hairs found in the beanie. They looked at her father. His name was John Keith Miller. Now, this guy, John Keith, he had been living quietly in Owatonna, Minnesota, just a couple hours south of where Mary had originally put her thumb out. He was right there the whole time. So this guy, John, was born on May 2nd, 1940. That's my birthday. But he had been living in Owatonna, Minnesota for quite a while. And that's about, like I said, 2 hours, I think, from where the crime happened. But back in 1974, when the murder occurred, he was just 33 years old, which fits the physical description from the witness. And then speaking of witnesses, I believe there were other witnesses that I think matched to his car that said that they described a white guy roughly 5'8" to 6 feet tall with light brown or hazel eyes and a big mustache. And they figured he was somewhere between his late 20s and mid 30s. And I think that came from descriptions of a man matching the description of that gold compact car. Now, John was no stranger to crime in his youth. He was convicted of forgery in 1960 and was released from prison in 1963. He married his first wife in October of 1963, but it didn't last because he was extremely violent. Yeah. And she claimed he once broke her jaw and then dragged her body down a street. He would often disappear for days, and it was during these disappearances that he committed most of these crimes. He robbed an auto supply store in September of 1965. He robbed a service station and stole $275, a shotgun, and some cigarettes. He got divorced in 1966 and went to prison again for a year. And then in 1967, when he was released, he went to California and then committed more robberies. He was then jailed again, then released in 1973, filed for a marriage application that same year, which would be his second wife. And maybe that's when he had his daughter and more kids through this marriage. And in February of 1974, less than 2 years after being released the second time from prison, he goes on to kill Mary. After this crime, he was convicted of a DUI in 1994 and in 2014 for drug possession and public intoxication. But who really knows what else he did and didn't get caught for? You know what I mean? Like, it seemed like most of his crimes were robberies and, in his youth, and then DUIs and drugs and stuff. But what else did he do? It's now November 7th, 2024. Half a century has passed since Mary was left in the snow. The Dunn County Sheriff's investigators, armed with the genetic genealogy evidence, drive down to Owatonna, Minnesota. They pull up to a house, they walk up to the door and knock. The man who answers is 84 years old. He's elderly. He looks like a grandfather, a retiree just living his last years, his good years. But the detectives know the truth. They are looking at the man whose stare had haunted Denny Anderson for 50 years. When the detectives sat John down and asked him about Mary Kay Schlase, what do you think he did? Do you think he denied it? Do you think he demanded a lawyer maybe? Do you think he showed an ounce of panic or remorse for hiding a secret for 5 decades? No. According to the police, he was just completely calm. He didn't put up a fight. He just confessed. He calmly admitted to the police that, in 1974, he picked up a woman hitchhiking, and he admitted that he asked her for sexual contact. He admitted that when she bravely said no and refused him, he grabbed a knife he had in the car and stabbed her in the back and continued stabbing her until she collapsed and stopped moving. He said Mary fought back. She used her hands to defend herself. and he admitted to dumping her body in Springbrook, Wisconsin. He said he tried to hide it in the snowbank, but panicked when another car came out of nowhere, so he just left the body and ran. He even confessed that the stocking cap was his. He didn't realize he lost it until he was shown the crime scene photos. He just didn't even realize he lost his beanie. He then admitted to throwing the knife in a swamp near his home, and he showed no remorse, no feeling during this confession. Instead, he told the police, maybe I'm just cold. Maybe I'm just cold-blooded.
I picked this girl up. I asked for sex. She said no. And I stabbed her and put her in a snowbank. I just figured I stabbed her and put her in the snowbank, and that was it. And then I got away with it.
Did you ever tell anyone what you did or talk about it at any time?
No.
How often did the crime pop back into your head? How often did you think about it over the last 50 years?
Hardly ever.
And why do you think that is?
Maybe I'm cold. I think I am cold-blooded.
What the actual... Are you kidding me? This man lived 50 years of freedom, 50 Thanksgivings, 50 Christmases. He got to experience the changing of the decades, the birth of his family, the comfort of a warm home, all of his birthdays. While Mary, a brilliant 25-year-old artist with her whole life ahead of her, was frozen in time. She never even got to see her 26th birthday. She never made it to that art show in Chicago. She never made it back home to live a normal life. He took everything from her just because she said no to sex. And then he just went home and lived his life like nothing happened. It's absolutely infuriating. And it makes me even more angry when these men, I'm not saying it's okay for single men to commit these crimes, but what I mean is like this guy had a wife. It's not like he couldn't get sex. You know what I mean? And even if she was refusing sex from him, like figure your shit out. You don't need to just like take it from another woman. I don't get men that think this way. It honestly feels like a slap in the face that he got to live his life, like full life, without being caught. Like, did he even live in fear of being caught? It doesn't seem like he did. But because his confession was so thorough and the DNA evidence from the Ramapo College team was absolutely solid, the legal process moved surprisingly fast for a cold case. John didn't drag Mary's remaining family through a grueling, agonizing trial. He just pleaded guilty. In March 2025, just months after his arrest, 84-year-old John Miller sat in a Wisconsin courtroom to face his sentencing. The courtroom was filled with the sadness of a 50-year-old tragedy. Mary's family members, those who were still alive to see this day, finally got to look at the monster that killed Mary. The judge didn't hold back. John Miller was sentenced to life in prison. At 84 years old, a life sentence means he will definitely die behind bars and he will take his last breath in a concrete cell, stripped of the freedom he stole from Mary and hoarded for himself for half a century. He was also ordered to pay $2,200 in restitution to Mary's family, and they then donated some of that money to the Ramapo College to help support cold case efforts. Is it perfect justice? Honestly, no. Perfect justice would be Mary getting to live her life. Perfect justice would be John Miller spending the prime of his life in a 6x8 cell, not enjoying his retirement before facing the consequences. But no one wants to die alone, and that's what will happen to him. And it's accountability. It's a final, undeniable statement that Mary mattered, that she was not forgotten, that the police, the scientists at Ramapo College, and the community refused to let her case be buried under that snow forever. I think another thing that makes me feel sad is that John Miller's family probably didn't know that he did this, and like they didn't know what type of a guy the husband was and what type of a guy the father truly was in him, like he was a husband and he was a father and then he was a killer. When I look at this case, the image I just can't get out of my head is that split-second stare. Denny Anderson, just a regular guy driving down the road, locking eyes with like pure evil. Like imagine later finding out that you witnessed a murder in action. And I'm sure he carried that scene with him for his entire life. He knew what he saw, and it took science 50 years to catch up to his memory. Mary Kay Schleiss should have been an old woman today. She would have been 76 years old. She should have had a house full of her own paintings. She was a product of her time, the 70s, where people were trusting, adventurous, wanting to see the world. And she was punished for it by a man whose ego was so fragile, he resorted to murder when he was rejected. It's such a heavy story. And I think what makes it so upsetting, at least for me, is that it was so random and so quick. Can you imagine if she was given a lift by another car? She would literally still be here most likely. But then would John have had another victim? But it's also an example of how you can never run far enough and you can never wait long enough to outrun the truth, you know? With the way DNA technology is advancing, the science and the technology is advancing, the monsters who have been hiding in plain sight for crimes committed in the past hopefully don't have much longer to hide. I hope that they are terrified every single time that there's a knock at the door. I really want to know what you guys think about this one. Does it make you as angry as it makes me that he got to live 50 years of freedom? Do you think a life sentence at 84 brings real closure, or is it too little too late? He already lived his life the way he wanted, you know? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Let's discuss it, but please always keep it respectful to Mary and her family. And if you found this video important, please give this video a big thumbs up. It tells the algorithm, the YouTube algorithm, to keep Mary's story visible. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, join the fam. To Mary and Mary's family, we are so sorry you had to wait 50 years, but we're so glad you finally have your answer. Rest in peace, Mary. Stay safe out there, guys. Don't hitchhike. Look out for each other and trust your gut. Besitos. See you next time. Bye.